The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe Park had been burning since dusk, and by the time the wine was called for, their light had softened every hard edge in the room except one. Eleanor Hartwell's hands did not shake as she lifted the heavy silver ewer from the sideboard, though her heart was beating so loudly she feared the nearest guests might hear it over the music. She had told herself 100 times since morning that she was nothing more than a pitcher and a pair of steady hands tonight. Nothing more. A woman who let herself be more than that, in this house, was a woman inviting ruin. She moved along the table with her eyes lowered, the way her aunt had trained her to do, filling goblets without meeting a single gaze, murmuring nothing, existing as little as a person could exist, while still being present in a room. It was a skill she had perfected over 3 years, ever since her father's death had turned her from a gentleman's daughter into something the Pemberton household could barely bring itself to name. Not quite a servant, never again a guest. Something in between, useful and unclaimed, like a chair kept in a hallway for no one in particular to sit in. She had almost reached the end of the table, almost finished the terrible, beautiful ordeal of serving wine to 50 of the county's most powerful families without being noticed by a single one of them, when a voice beside her said, quietly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, "You pour as though the wine matters more than the men drinking it." Eleanor's hand did not spill a drop. That, at least, she was proud of later. But her eyes came up before she could stop them, and she found herself looking at a man she did not recognize, seated in the shadow of a pillar where the candlelight barely reached, dressed well, but not richly, his dark coat plain beside the velvet and lace of the men around him. He was not among the guests she had been warned to attend to with particular care. He was, she assumed, someone's secretary, or a man of business, tucked into a seat where he would trouble no one and be troubled by no one in return. "Wine does not lie to a man about what it is, sir," she said, before she could think better of it. "That is more than I can say for most of what is poured in this hall tonight." She regretted it instantly. A servant did not speak so to a guest, however humble his seat. She braced for the cold correction her aunt would have delivered in her place, the kind that left a mark without ever raising a hand. But the man only looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he smiled, not broadly, not for show, but as though she had said something he intended to remember. "No," he said, "it does not." She should have moved on. The ewer was growing heavy, and Lady Pemberton's gaze, she could feel it even now, had a way of finding her from across any room, as though some invisible thread ran between them that never quite slackened. But something in the stranger's stillness held her a moment longer, and in that moment she noticed what she had missed before. His hands, folded loosely on the table, were unmarked by the labor of trade, yet he sat as though he had learned long ago that a man who says little is rarely contradicted, and a man who watches carefully is rarely deceived. "You are not from Hartswick," she said. It was not a question. "No," he agreed. "I am here on another man's business, mostly. My name is Julian Hale." "Eleanor," she said, and then caught herself, because a servant was not asked her name, and did not offer it, and certainly did not linger long enough over the giving of it to notice that the stranger seemed to weigh it, the way a man weighs a coin he suspects is worth more than its size suggests. Down the table, her aunt's voice rose in bright, practiced laughter, the laughter she kept for important company, and Eleanor felt the old cold drop through her stomach, the reflex of 3 years' training. She curtsied, too low for a mere secretary, but she did not trust herself to judge the correct depth just then, and moved on before Lady Pemberton's eyes could find her lingering. She did not see the way Julian Hale watched her go, nor the faint frown that crossed his face, nor the manner in which, a moment later, he leaned very slightly toward the elegant, golden-haired young woman being presented at the head of the table, presented, everyone understood, as a bride, and asked a single quiet question about the wine. Eleanor Hartwell had not always poured other people's wine. 3 years before, She had been Eleanor Hartwell of Bramfield, daughter of a modest but respected gentleman, promised nothing grand, but promised at least a life of her own choosing. Her father had died in the spring, quickly and without warning, and it was only in the terrible weeks that followed that she learned how thoroughly a man's debts could outlive him. There was no house left to inherit. There was, in the end, only a letter to her mother's sister, Lady Cassandra Pemberton of Ashcombe Park, and the cold, practical charity that followed, charity that came with conditions no one troubled to speak aloud, because everyone in the household understood them perfectly well. She would be housed, she would be fed. She would not, however, be presented, courted, or spoken of as a Pemberton. She would assist, she would be useful, and in exchange for these mercies, she would learn to want nothing, expect nothing, and be grateful for the nothing she was given. Her cousin Marianne had been 11 when Eleanor arrived, already beautiful in the particular, arranged way that beauty could be cultivated in a house with money enough to cultivate it, and by 17 she had become the ornament upon which her mother's every ambition was hung. Marianne was not cruel by nature, Eleanor sometimes thought, only thoughtless in the manner of someone who had never once in her life needed to consider another person's feelings before speaking. It was Lady Pemberton who was cruel, precisely and without exception, in the manner of a woman who believed cruelty, properly administered, was simply good management. "You will attend the banquet tonight," Lady Pemberton had told her that morning, not looking up from her correspondence. "You will pour the wine at the second table, and you will not speak unless spoken to, and you will not be spoken to, because no one of consequence speaks to servants. Do you understand me, Eleanor?" "Yes, Aunt. The Duke of Alderleigh is expected within the week, and this banquet is merely the beginning of a very delicate campaign. Marianne's future, and this family's future, depends upon every detail being perfect. I will not have you drawing eyes away from her with some clumsiness, or worse, some misplaced familiarity. You are not a Pemberton at this table, you are a pair of hands. Remember it." Eleanor had remembered it. She had remembered it every hour of every day for 3 years, until the words had worn a groove into her, the way water wears a groove into stone, patient and permanent. And she would have remembered it that evening too, would have poured every last drop of wine without a single word out of place, if a quiet man in a plain coat had not looked at her as though she were something more than a pair of hands, and asked her a question no one had thought to ask her in longer than she could bear to count. She did not know, could not have known, that the man calling himself Julian Hale was in fact Julian Ravensmore, His Grace the Duke of Alderleigh, and that the golden-haired young man seated at the head of the table, receiving bows and flattery, and Lady Pemberton's most dazzling smiles under the name of the Duke, was in truth his cousin Frederick, dressed in borrowed consequence for exactly one purpose, so that the real Duke might sit unnoticed in the shadows and discover, before a single vow was ever spoken, what manner of woman these great families were so eager to press upon him. It was Frederick's idea, in truth, though Julian had needed little persuading. 2 seasons prior, Julian had nearly married a woman who spoke to him with warmth and wit, and every appearance of true feeling, until the engagement was announced, and he discovered, by cruel accident, a letter in which she confessed to her sister that she found him tolerable enough, and his title considerably more so. He had broken the match quietly, at great cost to his reputation, and greater cost to whatever remained of his willingness to trust a smiling face. Since then, he had come to believe that a woman's true nature revealed itself only when she believed there was nothing to be gained by hiding it, which meant, inevitably, that he would never see it if she knew who he was. "You will hate every moment of this," Frederick had told him with some relish, adjusting his borrowed signet ring in the carriage mirror 3 days before, pretending to be a secretary, eating cold plates at the second table, being overlooked by every ambitious mother in the county. "I have been overlooked before," Julian had said, and there had been an old weariness in it that made Frederick, for once, hold his tongue. He had expected the evening to confirm everything he already believed about the daughters of great houses. The calculation dressed as charm, the warmth that switched on and off like a lamp, depending on who was watching. He had watched Marianne Pemberton across the long table with exactly that expectation in mind, and she had not disappointed him. Lovely, accomplished, utterly aware of her own value, directing her brightest smiles toward the man she believed to be a duke, and sparing scarcely a glance for anyone she judged beneath her notice. He had not expected the woman pouring the wine. He had noticed her first because she moved so differently from the other servants, not with the trained invisibility of the household staff, but with something held tightly in reserve, a posture that spoke of a woman who had once stood differently and had not entirely forgotten how. He had noticed her a second time because Lady Pemberton's eyes kept finding her across the room with a coldness that seemed disproportionate to the offense of pouring wine competently. And he had noticed her a third time decisively when she looked directly at him and answered his idle remark, not with the flattery he had braced himself for, but with something sharp and true, delivered with the particular courage of someone who has already decided the cost of honesty is a cost she is willing to pay. He found by the end of the evening that he wished to know a great deal more about the young woman called simply Eleanor, and considerably less about the young woman being paraded before him as a bride. The banquet lasted long past midnight, and Eleanor did not sit down once. By the time the last carriage rolled away down the long gravel drive, her feet ached, and her back had stiffened into a permanent, protective curve, but her mind kept returning, against her own strict instruction, to a plain dark coat and a pair of watchful eyes that had not once looked away from her as though she were furniture. She told herself it meant nothing. A secretary's idle curiosity, forgotten by morning. She had learned, in 3 years, precisely how much attention from a gentleman was worth to a woman in her position, which was to say, none at all, and often worse than none, for attention noticed by the wrong eyes could cost a girl her place in a household faster than any true fault of her own. And yet, she thought of it again the next morning, scrubbing the wine stains from the second table's linen in the cold light of the scullery, and she thought of it again that afternoon, when Lady Pemberton summoned her to help fit Marianne for a new gown, meant, everyone understood without being told, for the Duke's own eyes. She thought of it while she knelt at her cousin's hem, with pins between her lips, listening to Marianne chatter about the wealth and consequence of Alderleigh, about the fine house in town and the country seat, larger than 3 of the neighbouring estates combined, about how very agreeable it would be to be a duchess before she turned 19. "You did not even glance at him, I suppose," Marianne said, not unkindly, only with the particular obliviousness of someone who had never had cause to wonder what a servant thought about anything. "You were pouring wine the whole evening, weren't you? I hardly saw you at all." "I saw very little myself," Eleanor said, which was almost true. She did not mention the man in the plain coat. There was nothing to mention. And yet she found herself, 3 days later, in the walled orangery at the far edge of the gardens, where she had been sent to cut early blooms for the dinner table, looking up from the roses to find the very same man standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, an expression on his face that suggested he had not entirely intended to find her there either. "Mr. Hale," she said, rising too quickly, pricking her thumb on a thorn in her haste. "You've hurt yourself." He crossed the small space between them before she could protest, and though he did not touch her, he examined the small bead of blood on her thumb with a frown of genuine concern that struck her as entirely out of proportion to so small an injury. "Forgive me, I did not mean to startle you into carelessness." "It is nothing," she said, pressing the thumb into her palm. "I am not accustomed to being addressed at all, sir, let alone startled by it." "That seems to me a poor state of affairs," he said, "for a woman who speaks as well as you do." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and busied herself instead with the roses, cutting more of them than she needed simply to have something to do with her hands. He did not leave. He stood at the edge of the orangery, half in sunlight and half in shadow, and after a moment he asked, with the careful casualness of a man testing ground he was not certain would hold his weight, how long she had lived at Ashcombe Park. She told him, more than she meant to, in the end. She told him of her father, and of Bramfield, and of the letter to her aunt that had rearranged the whole of her life, without ever once asking whether she consented to the arrangement. She did not tell him everything. She kept back the sharpest of her griefs, the nights she had cried into a pillow so no one in the house would hear and use it against her later. But she told him more than she had told anyone in 3 years, and when she finished, feeling suddenly exposed, as though she had walked too far out into open water, she braced herself for pity, which she could not have borne, or for the polite disinterest of a man who had asked a question only to fill a silence. He gave her neither. "You have had a great deal taken from you," he said quietly, "and you have not once, in anything you have said, asked anyone to feel sorry for you. I find that rather remarkable. What use is sorrow to me?" She said, "It changes nothing. I would rather be useful than pitied." "Most people," he said, "given the choice, would rather be neither. They would rather be comfortable and unbothered and left entirely alone to enjoy what they already have. It is a rare thing to meet someone who has chosen usefulness over bitterness when bitterness would cost her nothing and would be so easily deserved." Something in his voice, low and certain, made her look up at him properly for the first time since he had entered the orangery, and what she saw in his face unsettled her more than anything he had said. He was looking at her the way one looks at something unexpectedly valuable, found in a place where one had not thought to look for value at all. "You speak very finely for a secretary, Mr. Hale," she said, because she needed, suddenly, to put some distance between them, even if only a sentence's worth. Something flickered across his face, amusement, or perhaps something closer to guilt, and was gone before she could name it. "I have had a good education," he said, which was true enough not to be a lie, though it was not, she would later understand, the whole truth either. They spoke a while longer, of nothing important, of the roses, of the weather, of a book of poems he claimed to be reading, though he could not, when pressed, recall a single line from it, which made her laugh despite herself, a real laugh, unguarded, the first in longer than she could remember. He left before anyone could find them together, slipping away with the quiet efficiency of a man well practiced in avoiding notice, and Eleanor stood alone among the roses for a long moment afterward, her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest, something she did not dare give a name to. There was, in those first days after the orangery, a hesitation on both sides that neither of them named. Eleanor told herself she would not seek him out again, and largely kept that promise, though she found herself lingering a moment longer than necessary whenever her errands carried her past the guest wing, and she was ashamed of the small, traitorous hope that rose in her each time a door opened down the corridor and proved, again and again, not to be his. Julian, for his part, spent those same days telling Frederick, with more conviction than he felt, that a single conversation among roses meant nothing at all, that he had simply been curious, that a duke, touring the county incognito, would naturally take an interest in whichever servant happened to speak her mind to him. Frederick, who had known his cousin since they were boys sharing a nursery, listened to these protestations with the patient, faintly amused silence of a man who does not trouble to argue with someone so plainly lying to himself. It was a chance meeting in the stable yard, 4 days later, that broke the stalemate. Eleanor had gone down at dusk, as she often did when the house grew too small for her thoughts, to visit an old grey mare named Juniper, who had belonged, once, to a groom long since retired, and who accepted apple cores and quiet company with equal grace. She did not expect to find Julian already there, seated on an overturned crate, with his coat unbuttoned and his cravat loosened in a manner no guest of consequence would ever have permitted himself in company, talking low and easy to a young stable hand about the conformation of a bay gelding recently purchased for the Pemberton stables. She nearly turned back, but Juniper, catching her scent, gave a low nicker of welcome that betrayed her presence before she could retreat, and Julian looked up, and something in his face, an unguarded pleasure he did not trouble to hide quickly enough, decided the matter for her. "You keep unusual company for a gentleman of business, Mr. Hale," she said, coming forward at last, because there seemed no dignity left in fleeing. "I find horses considerably more honest than most drawing rooms," he said, rising to make room for her on the crate, which she did not take, though she came to stand beside Juniper's stall, with the old mare's velvet nose pressed hopefully into her palm. They do not flatter a man for his coat, nor calculate the worth of his acquaintance. They simply are what they are, and they judge a man only by whether his hands are gentle. "And are your hands gentle, Mr. Hale?" "I hope so," he said, quietly enough that she felt the words more than heard them, and something in his tone made her look away first, busying herself with Juniper's mane to hide the colour that had risen, unbidden, to her cheeks. They talked longer than either of them intended, of horses and of Bramfield, where her father had kept a modest pair of carriage horses she had loved as a girl, and of Julian's own childhood, which he described with a carefulness that told her, even then, that there was more grief folded into it than he was yet willing to share. His mother had died when he was young, he said, and his father had raised him to believe that affection freely given was affection easily exploited, a lesson Julian had spent years unlearning, and, if he was honest, had not yet entirely unlearned. He asked her, at one point, what she would do with her life if no one's expectations bound her at all, and she was so startled by the question, no one had ever asked her to imagine such a thing, that she laughed before she could answer, a short, disbelieving sound. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have spent 3 years learning to want nothing, Mr. Hale. It is not so easily undone, the wanting." "Then perhaps," he said, "it wants practice, small wants to begin. What is one thing, however foolish, that you have wished for and told yourself you should not?" She hesitated a long moment, and then, because the dusk made confessions easier than daylight ever did, she told him she wished, foolishly, to see the sea. Her father had promised her a journey to the coast the summer he died, and the promise had died with him, unfulfilled, and, she had thought, unfulfillable. Julian said nothing for a moment, only looked at her with an expression she could not read, and then he said, quite simply, "I have seen the sea a great many times, and I confess I have never once thought to be grateful for it until this moment." It was such an odd thing to say that she nearly asked him to explain himself, but the stable-yard bell rang for supper just then, and the moment slipped away unfinished, leaving her to wonder, long into the night, what exactly he had meant. It became, over the following days, a pattern neither of them acknowledged aloud. He would find her, in the library while she was sent to fetch a book for her aunt, in the stable-yard while she walked off an hour's frustration among the horses who did not care what she was worth to anyone, once even in the kitchen garden at dusk, where he claimed, unconvincingly, to have lost his way back from a walk. Each time, he asked her questions no one else had thought to ask, about her opinions, her small joys, the books she loved, and the ones she pretended to love, because pretending was safer than wanting anything too visibly. Each time, she found herself answering more honestly than she meant to, drawn out of her careful reserve by the simple, extraordinary fact of being listened to. She told herself it could not matter. He was, whatever his true circumstances, a man of no particular fortune attached to a duke's household, a secretary, a companion, perhaps a distant relation, given a place out of family obligation, and she was a poor relation herself, doubly poor for having no beauty of note and no dowry at all, kept in her aunt's house on sufferance and nothing more. Even if his interest were real, even if the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her meant what her foolish heart wanted it to mean, there was no future in it that either of their circumstances could sustain. And yet knowing this did nothing to still the quiet, persistent hope that had begun, despite every warning she gave herself, to take root somewhere beneath her ribs. It was Marianne who noticed first, though she noticed the wrong thing entirely. "You have been different lately," her cousin observed one evening, watching Eleanor pin up her hair with more attention than usual. "Almost pretty, when you smile like that. What has come over you?" "Nothing has come over me," Eleanor said, too quickly, and Marianne's eyes narrowed with the particular sharpness of a beautiful girl who has never had to work for attention and is instinctively alert to the possibility of a rival, however unlikely. "It had better be nothing," Marianne said, not unkindly, but with a warning underneath the words. "Mamma would not be pleased if you were engaging in some flirtation while the Duke's household is in residence. You know how she feels about anything that might reflect poorly on this family just now." Eleanor said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say, and because the warning, however casually delivered, settled into her stomach like a stone. She had allowed herself, over these stolen weeks, to forget, or to pretend to forget, the precariousness of her position. A servant's affection for a man above her station was not a private matter. In a house like Ashcombe Park, it was a liability, a risk to be managed and, if necessary, removed. She resolved, that night, to be more careful. She resolved it again the following morning, and again the morning after that, and each time her resolve dissolved the moment she saw Julian Hale waiting for her in whatever quiet corner of the estate he had chosen that day, his whole face changing, softening, the instant he caught sight of her, as though she were the answer to a question he had been asking for a very long time without knowing it. There were signs in those weeks that a more suspicious woman might have read correctly, and that Eleanor, wrapped in the novelty of being noticed, chose not to examine too closely. She saw, once, from the far end of a corridor, a tailor from the county town, bowing so low to Mr. Hale that his forehead nearly brushed his own knee, an excess of deference, strange for a mere secretary. She saw the way Frederick, playing his borrowed part as Duke, with visible discomfort, deferred to Julian, in small, unconscious ways, whenever he thought no one of consequence was watching, glancing toward him before answering a question of any weight, as a man glances toward the person whose judgment he trusts above his own. She noticed, too, that the household staff, who could be relied upon to know the truth of any guest within a day of his arrival, through channels no drawing-room ever mapped, treated Mr. Hale with a curious, careful respect that did not match his plain coat or his modest place at the second table. She noticed all of it and explained it away each time with the same quiet, deliberate refusal that had carried her through 3 years of swallowed grief. "It is not my business to wonder. Whatever he is, he has been kind to me, and kindness asks nothing in return but gratitude." She did not let herself wonder further, because to wonder further was to hope, and hope, she had learned at great cost, was a luxury poor relations could rarely afford to keep. It was in the library, on a rain-grey afternoon 3 weeks into his stay, that he came nearest to saying something neither of them could take back. She had been sent to fetch a volume of sermons for her aunt, and had lingered, as she often did in that room, running her fingers along spines she was not permitted to read at leisure, when she turned and found him standing closer than he usually stood, his expression unusually grave. "Eleanor," he said, and something in the way he said her name, not Miss Hartwell, never that, but simply Eleanor, as though the shorter, softer form of it were a small intimacy he had claimed for himself weeks ago and had no intention of surrendering, made her breath catch. "I must tell you something, and I find I do not know how to begin." Her heart rose into her throat. For one wild, unguarded moment, she let herself believe he meant to declare himself, to say some version of the words she had not admitted, even to herself, in the dark of her narrow room, that she longed to hear. "There is a great deal about my circumstances," he went on, choosing each word with visible care, "that I have not been entirely honest about. I came here under a name that is mine, but not entirely the whole of who I am. I had my reasons, and I believe them to be good reasons, but I am aware that a woman placed as you are placed has had quite enough of men who are not what they seem, and I would rather tell you the truth myself than have you learn it from someone else, in some manner that does you harm." Eleanor went very still. "What is it you have not told me, Mr. Hale?" He opened his mouth to answer, and it was in that exact moment, with the rain sheeting grey against the tall windows and the whole confession poised on his tongue, that the library door opened and Lady Pemberton's voice cut across the room like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Eleanor, what precisely do you imagine you are doing?" Eleanor turned, the sermon book clutched against her chest like armor, and saw her aunt standing in the doorway with an expression of such controlled fury that the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Behind Lady Pemberton, half visible in the hall, stood Marianne, her pretty face caught between curiosity and something that looked almost like satisfaction. "I was fetching the book you asked for, Aunt," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. For a quarter of an hour, alone with a gentleman, in a closed room, Lady Pemberton's gaze slid to Julian, cool and assessing, the look of a woman calculating precisely how much damage had been done and how quickly it might be contained. "Mr. Hale, I must ask you to excuse us. My niece has duties elsewhere." There was nothing Julian could say in that moment that would not have made matters considerably worse for Eleanor, and Eleanor watched, with something like despair, as he seemed to understand this too, his jaw tightening, his hands closing briefly into fists at his sides, before he inclined his head with careful courtesy and withdrew, throwing her one last look over his shoulder, a look that promised he was not finished, that whatever he had meant to say would be said, before the door closed behind him. Lady Pemberton did not raise her voice. She never did. It was one of the things that made her cruelty so effective. She simply crossed the room, took the sermon book from Eleanor's hands, and set it down upon the table with exaggerated gentleness, as though the gentleness of the gesture were meant to underscore, by contrast, exactly how little gentleness would follow. "I gave you a home," she said quietly, "when no one else was obliged to give you anything at all. I fed you and clothed you and asked in return only that you not embarrass this family. Do you understand what it would mean, Eleanor, if the household staff, if Mr. Hale himself, if his employers came to hear of it, began to whisper that Lord Pemberton's household keeps a poor relation who makes eyes at gentlemen in the library? Do you understand what that would do to Marianne's prospects, at the very moment when everything depends upon this family appearing beyond reproach? Nothing improper happened, Aunt. We were speaking, that is all." "Speaking?" Lady Pemberton's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "I have watched you these past weeks, Eleanor. I am not a fool, whatever you may think of me. You will not see Mr. Hale again, alone, under any circumstance, and I have decided that it is time we found a more permanent solution to the difficulty you present to this household. There is a Mr. Aldous Grimshaw, a widower of considerable property near Bexley, who has expressed a willingness to take a wife without a dowry, provided she is biddable and grateful. I have written to him already. I expect his answer within the fortnight." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she did not move. Aldous Grimshaw was 60 if he was a day, a man with a reputation in the county for a temper that had, by all accounts, hastened his first 2 wives into early graves. "You cannot mean to sell me to that man," she whispered. "I mean," said Lady Pemberton, "to see you settled, before you cost this family something we cannot afford to lose. You will thank me for it, in time. Gratitude is a habit, Eleanor, like any other, and I have given you 3 years to practice it. I would advise you not to disappoint me now." She left the room without waiting for a response, and Eleanor stood alone among the shelves of books she was not permitted to read for pleasure, in a house that was not her home, facing a marriage that would be nothing short of a slow, respectable death, and she found, to her own surprise, that the tears that came were not for herself alone. but for the conversation cut short in the library, for whatever truth Julian Hale had been about to tell her, for the small, foolish hope she had let herself carry these past weeks, like a lit candle cupped against the wind, now guttering, now nearly gone. She did not see him again that day, nor the next. She told herself it was for the best. She told herself, lying awake in her narrow bed, that whatever confession he had been on the verge of making could only have complicated a situation already impossible, and that it was mercy, of a kind, to have it interrupted before either of them said something that could not be unsaid. She almost believed it. It was Frederick, the false Duke, whose conscience had grown steadily heavier over the course of the visit as he watched his cousin's careful, guarded heart open by degrees toward a woman neither of them was permitted to claim, who finally forced the matter to its crisis. "You cannot go on like this, Julian," Frederick said, late one night in the rooms they shared, after Julian had spent the better part of an hour standing at the window in grim silence. "You have let this go on for weeks. The girl deserves to know who you are, and you deserve to stop pretending to be a man with no name and no future to offer her. And I am tired," he added, with real feeling, "of playing Duke to a house full of women who look at me the way one looks at a particularly fine horse. I did not sign on for a season of it." "I meant to tell her," Julian said. Her aunt interrupted before I could. "Then finish what you started. There is a ball at the end of the week, the grand one, the one this entire visit has been building toward. Tell her before it, or tell her at it, but tell her, Julian, before her aunt marries her off to some country brute out of spite, which I have heard, from my own maid no less, is precisely what Lady Pemberton intends." The news struck Julian like a blow. He had noticed, these past days, a new tightness around Eleanor's eyes whenever they passed in a corridor, a new carefulness in the distance she kept from him, and he had assumed, with the particular blindness of a man unused to having his intentions doubted, that it was simply obedience to her aunt's command. He had not imagined that her very future was being disposed of, quietly and irrevocably, while he hesitated over the proper way to confess a truth he ought to have told her weeks ago. He resolved, that night, to end the deception at the earliest possible moment, and found, to his fury, that the moment did not come soon enough. The night of the grand ball arrived with all the glittering, merciless spectacle such occasions demanded. Ashcombe Park had been transformed, every chandelier lit, every mirror polished to catch and multiply the candlelight, every family of consequence in 3 counties assembled beneath one roof, to witness what everyone understood to be the near-certain announcement of an engagement between the Duke of Alderleigh and Miss Marianne Pemberton. Eleanor had been assigned, once again, to the wine, a small mercy, she thought bitterly, that at least allowed her to keep moving, to keep her hands occupied, to avoid standing still long enough to feel the full weight of what was coming. Mr. Grimshaw's letter had arrived 2 days prior, his acceptance prompt, and, Lady Pemberton had noted with satisfaction, generous in its terms. The wedding was to take place within the month. She had not told Julian. She had scarcely spoken to him since the library, catching only glimpses of him across rooms, at a distance that felt, now, permanent and correct. The distance that had always, in truth, existed between them, however much she had let herself forget it, in a garden full of roses. She was halfway down the second table, pouring with the same trained steadiness that had carried her through 100 such evenings, when a commotion near the great doors drew every eye in the hall. A royal messenger, still travel-worn, strode into the room, and without so much as a glance at Frederick seated in his borrowed place of honor, crossed directly to the shadowed corner where Julian stood in his plain dark coat, and bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knee. "Your Grace," the messenger said, his voice carrying, unintentionally or not, to every corner of the suddenly silent hall, a matter of some urgency, from His Majesty's own hand. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor felt it settle over the room like snow, felt every head turn first to the messenger, then to Julian, then, dawning, disbelieving, to Frederick, who had gone the colour of old parchment in his seat at the head of the table. "Your Grace," someone whispered, and the words rippled outward through the assembled guests, like a stone dropped into still water, gathering speed and disbelief as they went. Eleanor stood frozen, with the ewer still in her hands, the silver suddenly, impossibly heavy, as understanding broke over her in a cold and terrible wave. Julian Hale, Mr. Hale, the quiet secretary, the man who had asked her opinion of poetry in the orangery, who had listened to her speak of her dead father as though every word mattered. Julian Hale was the Duke of Alderleigh. He had been the Duke the entire time. Every conversation, every stolen hour, every moment she had believed herself, however foolishly, to be seen and valued for herself alone. All of it had happened under a false name, a disguise worn by a man powerful enough to reshape her whole world with a single word, and he had said nothing. She did not remember setting down the ewer. She remembered only the roaring in her ears, the sudden suffocating heat of the hall, and the desperate, animal need to be anywhere else, away from the eyes that were beginning, slowly, to turn toward her, Lady Pemberton's, sharp with dawning fury. She turned and fled the hall before anyone could stop her, out through the side passage and into the cool dark of the garden, where the music and the murmur of 50 scandalized voices faded slowly behind her into the general hush of the night. She did not stop until she reached the orangery, the very place where he had first found her among the roses, and there, finally, she let herself weep, not for the loss of a secretary's affection, which had never truly existed, but for the loss of the one person in 3 years who had made her feel, however briefly, that she was worth more than the labor of her hands. He found her there, as she had known, with some despairing certainty that he would. "Eleanor," his voice was low, careful, the voice of a man approaching something wounded and unpredictable. "Please, let me explain." "There is nothing to explain, Your Grace." She did not turn. The title came out of her mouth like a stone, hard and deliberate, a wall thrown up between them, where no wall had stood a week before. "You are a duke. I am a poor relation who pours your wine. I understand the arrangement perfectly." It was never an arrangement. He crossed the room until he stood close behind her, though he did not touch her, seeming to understand, even now, that he had not earned the right to. "I came here disguised because I have been deceived before, by a woman who wanted my title and pretended to want me. I wished, before I ever pledged myself to anyone again, to know whether a person could care for me without knowing what I could give her. I did not expect." He stopped, and when he spoke again, his voice had roughened with something that sounded, to her disbelieving ears, almost like grief. "I did not expect to find someone who cared for nothing I could give her at all, because you never once knew there was anything to give. That is not a deception I regret, Eleanor. It is the truest thing I have learned in years. And what was I to you then?" She turned at last, and the fury and hurt in her face made him flinch, though he did not step back. An experiment, a test to be observed and recorded, like a specimen in a naturalist's book. "You let me speak to you of my father, of my grief, of things I have not told another living soul in 3 years, and all the while you were measuring me, deciding whether I was worthy of a duke's notice." "No." The word came out of him with such force that it startled them both. "No, Eleanor, that is not. I stopped measuring you within the first sane night. I have spent every day since trying to find the courage to tell you the truth, and every day the truth grew heavier, because I feared exactly this, that you would look at me and see only the deception, and never the man who meant every word he said to you in that library, in this very room, in the stable yard where you laughed at my terrible attempt to discuss poetry I had never read. I meant it, Eleanor, all of it. I have never meant anything so entirely in my life." She wanted, with a desperation that frightened her, to believe him. But 3 years of survival had taught her precisely how dangerous it was to let herself want something before it was certain, and so she held herself rigid against the pull of his voice, his nearness, the terrible sincerity in his face. "It does not matter what you meant," she said. "In 2 days I am to marry Mr. Grimshaw of Bexley. My aunt has arranged it, and there is no power either of us possesses that can undo 3 years of debt and obligation with a confession in a garden." "There is one power," Julian said quietly, "that I possess and have not yet used, because I did not wish to use my title as a weapon before I had earned the right to speak to you as a man. But if it is the only way to stop this, if it is the only way to keep you from being sold into a marriage that will destroy you, then I will use it, Eleanor, and gladly." She stared at him, and for the first time since the messenger's bow had shattered every certainty she had built her life upon, something other than fury and grief stirred in her chest. A small, wary, disbelieving hope. He did not wait for the ball to end. He returned to the great hall, with Eleanor a pace behind him, her heart hammering, and the assembled guests, who had spent the intervening quarter hour in a frenzy of whispered speculation, fell silent once more, as the true Duke of Alderleigh walked the length of the hall, past his stricken cousin, past a white-faced Lady Pemberton, until he stood before the entire glittering assembly and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "I owe this company an apology," he said, "for a deception I entered into, for reasons that seemed sound to me at the time, and which I will not trouble you with tonight. But I will not leave this hall without correcting a far graver wrong that I have only just learned of, a wrong done not by me, but sanctioned, I understand, within this very household." Lady Pemberton's composure, so carefully maintained through 3 years of quiet cruelty, began, for the first time, visibly to crack. "Your Grace, I am certain whatever you have heard has been—" "I have heard," Julian continued, "that Miss Eleanor Hartwell, a gentleman's daughter and a member of this family by blood, has been kept these 3 years in a state little better than servitude, and is now to be married, against her own wishes, to a man 3 times her age, with a reputation this county does not speak of kindly, purely to remove an inconvenience from this household's ambitions. I have heard this, and I have seen enough of Miss Hartwell's character these past weeks, her honesty, her dignity, her kindness under circumstances that would have hardened a lesser spirit into bitterness, to know that whatever the truth of her birth or fortune, she is worth 10 of the calculating creatures this season has paraded before me in ballrooms far grander than this one." A murmur swept the hall, scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. Marianne had gone quite pale, and beside her, Lady Pemberton's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. "I will not pretend," Julian said, and now his voice softened, though it lost none of its carrying force, "that I have any right to speak for Miss Hartwell's own wishes in this matter. That right belongs to her alone, and I have wronged her enough already by concealing my name that I will not compound it by presuming to know her heart. But I will say, before every person in this hall, that if she will have me, not as a duke, for she has never once cared for that, but as the man she knew in the orangery, and the library, and the stable-yard, I would count myself the most fortunate man in England." Every eye in the hall turned to Eleanor, standing pale and trembling at the edge of the crowd, in her plain grey gown, among a sea of silk and jewels, more exposed in that moment than she had ever felt pouring wine at 100 banquets. She thought of 3 years of swallowed grief, of a marriage arranged out of spite, of a man who had looked at her, disguised and unguarded, and seen not a pair of useful hands, but a woman worth knowing. She thought of the small, stubborn dignity she had clung to through every humiliation, the dignity that had told her, again and again, that she was worth more than this house had ever allowed her to believe. "You let me believe," she said, and her voice, though quiet, reached every corner of the silent hall, "that I mattered to a man with nothing to offer me but honest conversation. That is a gift I did not know I still had the capacity to receive, Your Grace, and I have spent 3 days grieving the loss of it, believing it had never been real at all." "It was the only real thing," Julian said, "in a season built entirely on performance." She crossed the remaining distance between them, past her aunt's furious, helpless stare, past Marianne's stunned silence, past 50 guests who would talk of nothing else for a month, and stopped before him with her chin lifted in the manner she had learned, painfully, over 3 hard years, the manner of a woman who had decided, once and for all, that she would not shrink to fit the smallness others had assigned her. "Then let it be real now," she said, as itself, without the disguise. "I will not marry a duke who tested me. I will consider, only consider, your grace, marrying a man who, having tested me and found me worthy, has the courage to spend the rest of his life proving he was worth the trust in return." Something broke open in Julian's face, relief and joy, and something rawer beneath both, and he took her hand before the entire assembled company, pressing it with a reverence that silenced whatever remained of the room's scandalized murmuring. "I accept the terms," he said, gladly, "and for as long as it takes." Lady Pemberton did not forgive the humiliation of that night, nor the arrangement with Mr. Grimshaw, quietly and permanently dissolved the following morning by a letter bearing the ducal seal, its tone as courteous as it was absolutely final. But her power over Eleanor, which had shaped and constrained 3 years of a young woman's life, evaporated the moment the Duke of Alderleigh made his intentions known, before witnesses too numerous and too well connected for any scheme of hers to overturn. Marianne, for her part, recovered from her disappointment with more grace than anyone expected, and within a year had made a happy match of her own with a baronet who valued her wit rather more than her mother's ambitions had ever thought to. The courtship that followed was neither swift nor entirely smooth. Trust, once broken, does not mend in a single grand gesture, however dramatic, and there were quiet evenings in the weeks that followed the ball when Eleanor still felt the sting of having been observed before she was known, still needed Julian's patient, steady presence to remind her that the man beside her now was the same man who had listened to her speak of her father in a rain-grey library, disguise or no disguise. There was one evening, a fortnight after the ball, when the old hurt rose in her so sharply that she nearly sent him away altogether, telling him through the closed door of the small parlour Lady Pemberton had grudgingly allowed them, that she could not be certain, not truly certain, whether he loved Eleanor Hartwell or merely the idea of a woman who had not known enough to flatter him. Julian did not force the door. He sat instead on the step outside it for the better part of an hour, in the cold, and when at last she opened the door herself, undone by the simple, stubborn fact of his waiting, he said only, "I will sit outside every door you close to me, Eleanor, for as long as it takes you to trust that I am not going anywhere. That is the whole of my proof. I have no other." It was, she thought later, exactly the right thing to say, because it asked nothing of her and promised everything of himself, and slowly, over the weeks that followed, the careful distance she had kept between them began to close. He brought her, one grey afternoon, a small oil painting of the sea he had commissioned from a local artist working only from his own descriptions of the Dorset coast, and told her, with the particular awkwardness of a man unused to admitting sentiment, that it was a poor substitute for the real journey he intended to give her the moment she would permit it. She wept over that small painting longer than she was willing to admit to him, and hung it, when at last she had her own rooms to hang things in, above the mantel where she would see it every morning. Lady Pemberton attempted, twice more, to salvage some advantage from the wreckage of her schemes, once by suggesting to anyone who would listen that Eleanor had engineered the whole affair through calculated cunning, a rumour that dissolved within the week under the simple, devastating weight of every servant in the household testifying, unprompted, to 3 years of witnessed unkindness, and once by writing directly to Julian to suggest that a girl raised on charity could hardly be expected to manage a duchess's obligations without guidance, a letter to which Julian responded with such icy, immaculate courtesy that Lady Pemberton did not attempt a third approach. Marianne, to her credit, wanted no part of her mother's continued campaigns, and in the quiet months that followed, An unlikely, careful friendship grew between the two cousins, built on the plain, mutual relief of two young women, no longer measured against one another for a prize neither of them, in the end, had truly wanted on the terms it was offered. But trust, given time and honesty enough to grow, does mend, and by the following spring, when Eleanor Hartwell became Eleanor Ravensmore, Duchess of Alderleigh, in a small chapel wedding attended by far fewer guests than the grand ball that had first revealed him, but filled with far more genuine joy, she stood before the altar not as a pair of useful hands, not as an inconvenience quietly disposed of, but as herself, chosen, entirely and without disguise, by a man who had looked past every title and circumstance to find, in a woman pouring wine at the edge of a crowded hall, the one truth he had been searching for all along. Frederick stood as witness, visibly relieved to have surrendered his borrowed title for the last time, and leaned toward his cousin just before the vows to murmur that he hoped never again to be asked to play duke to a house full of ambitious mothers, a remark that made Eleanor laugh so unexpectedly, so entirely without the careful restraint of 3 long years, that the sound of it carried through the small chapel and settled, warm and unguarded, into everyone who heard it. True to his word, Julian took her to the sea that very summer, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the water for a long, silent while, her father's unfulfilled promise finally made whole, before turning to the man beside her, no longer a disguised stranger, no longer a duke, observing from the shadows, but simply Julian, watching her with the same unguarded tenderness he had first shown her among the roses, and telling him, with the plain, unhurried honesty she had once thought too dangerous to give anyone, that she had never once, in the whole of her difficult life, imagined she would be permitted to be this happy. She kept, for the rest of her life, a small bowl of orangery roses on the table nearest her favorite window, and she never poured a glass of wine again without remembering the quiet stranger who had once told her that wine did not lie about what it was, and who had, in the end, proven himself to be exactly the man his eyes had always promised, disguise fully and finally set aside.